Okay, so we're right on 1:45, so we're going to make a start again. So just welcome everyone back and thank you for joining us in person and online again this afternoon for our final session. So our first speaker for session 3 is Dr. Cheneal Puljević, who is a research fellow with the Tobacco Endgame Centre of Research Excellence at the School of Public Health at the University of Queensland. And Dr. Puljević holds an ARC Discovery Early Career Researcher Award that is focused on understanding the drivers and deterrents of illicit tobacco purchasing in Australia. Her research has previously focused on reducing tobacco use among priority populations, primarily people who are experiencing incarceration or homelessness, and looking at reducing harms associated with illicit drug use. So Dr. Puljević has expertise in mixed methods research, including systematic reviews, qualitative data analysis, and development and analysis of cross-sectional surveys, and she's an investigator with the Global Drugs Survey. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Puljević to the microphone, and she's going to talk to us about why we need to be concerned about illicit tobacco market in Australia. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. You'll notice that I've changed it from a statement to a question, so leave you some intrigue. Anyways, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cheneal Puljević. Thank you all for coming along. It's such a pleasure to be here and be joined by colleagues from all around Australia and Aotearoa. So today I'm going to be discussing some very early research that we've started. Well, technically, I'm not actually presenting any research findings today, but this is a relatively new area of research for me. It's very exciting, and I hope you find it as interesting as I do. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet and recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So, what is illicit tobacco? So illicit tobacco products refer to any tobacco products for which the necessary duties and taxes haven't been paid. There are typically 3 kinds of illicit tobacco products. So first, there is unbranded loose leaf tobacco, commonly called chop chop in Australia, which is typically loose leaf tobacco sold in clear Ziploc bags. So here you can see some pictures, a picture of some bags of chop chop from a recent seizure in Gatton here in Queensland. Chop chop is typically produced domestically, with domestic production of tobacco illegal since 2006. And here you can see an ABC News article describing the destruction of $31 million worth of tobacco crops in rural Victoria in February this year. Next, there's counterfeit cigarettes, which are illegally manufactured or imported cigarettes in counterfeit packaging. So here you can see an example of illicit tobacco products in counterfeit packaging that is intending to mimic Australian plain packaging with graphic health warnings. The only giveaway here is that there's no such thing as a brand called Organic Blend in Australia, but besides that, we can see now that manufacturers are adapting to make their products appear legal. So it's only a matter of time before it will be quite hard for us to tell the difference between the two, and that obviously causes difficulties for our research. And then third, there's illegally imported foreign brands. So here are 4 pictures of products that have been found in Brisbane. So of course it is possible that some of these have been brought in legally by tourists, but we have reason to believe that all of these are illicit. So the top 2 photos are from a colleague of mine who takes photos of illegal products that he finds on the street, typically in West End where he lives. So He-Won kindly translated them for me. She said the Africa Mojo brand, the top right, is particularly popular among adolescents because they have random flavored capsules in them. So you get a surprising different flavor in each cigarette. And we strongly suspect it's illicit because of the lack of text or graphic health warnings, which were implemented in Korea in 2005 and 2016, respectively. And then the bottom left photo is one that He-Won found outside her apartment recently in South Brisbane as well, also with lack of graphic health warnings or text warnings. And then the bottom right photo is a box of Marlboros from my lovely neighbour who buys them for $9 a box. So what's interesting, he was originally paying $15 a box, then $13 and now $9. And he asked the retailer, why is the price decreasing? And the retailer said, well, there's so much competition now in the area that I've had to lower my prices. So So what drives illicit tobacco use? So there's a handful of studies that have interviewed consumers about why they choose to use illicit tobacco. And of course, cheaper price is a very obvious reason, but some others say that price is not a major factor. For some of them, they prefer the brands for various reasons, such as people from overseas may prefer brands from home, or some people prefer to buy these products as they see that they're sticking it to the government in some way because they're not paying taxes to the government. Some people perceive the chop in particular, the loose leaf tobacco in the bags, as healthier than legal tobacco because they perceive it as organic and missing the chemicals that the tobacco companies put in. And we also wanted to know whether whether there's any influence of tobacco control policies. So we have a PhD student, Isabel Mechia, who's recently joined our team, and she has conducted a scoping review as part of her master's project looking at the impact of tobacco control policies on illicit trade. Of the 51 studies, we found 41, so 80% of them were about tobacco tax increases, and there was very mixed evidence. Around half found that there was an increase, and while the others found that there was no change or a decrease. And there was very limited evidence for the impact of other policies, such as plain packaging. So how prevalent is it in Australia? Well, there are multiple data sources we can look at, and all of them suggest that there are notable increases in use of illicit tobacco products in the last few years. So these are some of the data sources that I'm going to discuss now. So first, here are data from Australia's National Drug Strategy Household Survey. And from 2013 to 2019, we can see an increase in the number of people who smoke who report current use of illicit tobacco. But the numbers are low and the increase is not significant, so this data suggests maybe. Here we have data from Euromonitor. So Euromonitor International is a market research company that produces reports on international tobacco markets. And there is evidence that they have received funding from 2 organizations funded by Philip Morris International. Their methods are not disclosed, and their estimates have been criticized for being quite inconsistent compared to official estimates, but their data do suggest increasing use. It is important to know about it, I guess. Then these figures are from the Australian Taxation Office, showing a very clear increase in illicit tobacco seizures in recent years. So this graph shows the value of illicit tobacco seized before entering the market. So this was worth around 135 million in 2015 or 16, and this gradually then increased to 796 million in 2019-20. And then in the final year, we see a very sharp increase where it more than doubled in that one financial year to just over $2 billion. And that final figure is 15 times that of the 2015-16 figure. Then this graph is from the ATO's website, showing increases in both the gross and net tobacco tax gap percentages. So the gross gap, which is the light blue line at the top, is the amount of illicit tobacco that attempted to enter the market. So that includes all of the undetected illicit tobacco products that made it to market, plus the illicit tobacco that was seized. And then the net gap, which is the dark blue line at the bottom, is the amount of illicit tobacco that the ATO estimates was undetected in the Australian market. So for the net gap, the ATO estimates that the amount of illicit tobacco in the Australian market has doubled in the time period shown in the graph, and now forms just over 10% of the overall tobacco market. For the final financial year there, 2020-21, the ATO estimates a net gap of 1,234 tonnes of illicit tobacco that was undetected in the Australian market. And the duty value of that is $1.9 billion. Of that, 85% is undetected importation from other countries, and around 15% of that is tax evaded from illicit domestic production. So now you may or may not remember the title of this presentation. Should we be concerned? Well, thus far I have covered 2 points that suggest that the answer is yes. So first, from the various data I showed you, we can say with some certainty that the prevalence is increasing. This is also supported by anecdotal reports from Queensland Health, Queensland Border Force, Queensland Police, and a number of mental health services who all report that they've noticed dramatic increases in consumers with illicit tobacco and seizures of illicit tobacco in recent years, especially the last year. And then second, as I mentioned, as I showed on the last slide, the illicit tobacco market is resulting in substantial losses in tax revenue for the government. And while that is partly due to Australia's very high tobacco prices compared to other countries, a loss of $1.9 billion in a single financial year is certainly something to take note of. Then, third, it's clear that the widespread availability of very cheap tobacco products undermines the intended impact of supply-focused tobacco control policies, such as tobacco tax increases. So I'm sure many of us are familiar with this lovely graph that shows a very clear drops in prevalence as each tobacco tax increase was introduced. But of course, if these products are widely available and are very cheap, $9 a box, then the intended impact of tobacco increases is lost. Next, the availability of illicit tobacco disproportionately affects people who smoke and who experience disadvantage. By nature, of course, the illicit tobacco market is populated by consumers whose main concern is price. And so people who are addicted to nicotine but who might not be able to pay the high price of legal products may, of course, turn to purchasing these much cheaper illicit products rather than quitting smoking, thus perpetuating the use of this harmful product. Fifth, now this is an interesting one. There is some evidence suggesting that illicit tobacco that the market is largely operated by organized crime syndicates and violent political groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who use the product's high profitability to to fund other crimes such as the global arms trade and terrorism. So here's an ABC News article describing this issue in more detail, where they quote spokespeople from the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission who say that the amount of profit that they make on just one container means that only 1 out of 30 containers needs to make it through the border in order for them to make a profit. And of course, the profits are not as much as illicit drugs, but the penalties are a lot less. And so the risk-reward payoff is a lot more favorable to organized crime groups. A friend of mine mentioned that a friend of theirs used to sell cannabis and cocaine, but has switched now to only selling tobacco because the risk is much lower and they actually make more money overall. All right, and then I briefly mentioned this earlier. Although some people believe that Chop Chop is healthier because it's more natural, there is evidence that it can actually be even worse for consumers' health. This is because research has shown that some batches of illicit tobacco contains twigs, leaves, cottons, grass clippings, and vendors often add water to the Chop Chop as well to increase its weight, thus increasing the risk of mold. And there's strong evidence that inhaling fungal spores is associated with a number of serious health risks. So number 7, it seems that the Australian Border Force only have the resources to search a very small number of incoming shipments. So there's an estimate that they're only searching around 7% of incoming shipments. And those are ones that they already deem as high risk. And they said in the news article last week that they're only managing to detect a quarter of illicit drugs making it into the market. So it makes you wonder how much tobacco is making it into the market as well. And then finally, a really important point to acknowledge is that the tobacco industry uses illicit tobacco as a strategic political tool to lobby governments to lower tobacco tax and to oppose new tobacco control policies, because they argue that those policies increase the illicit tobacco market. So this is where I want to make a really clear acknowledgement that, of course, many of the things I've mentioned here are exactly what the tobacco industry say to overinflate the issue of illicit tobacco. And that's why I've attempted to provide a number of data sources, not only those funded by the industry, that do suggest that this is potentially an issue of increasing concern. So a bit more about the role of industry. So this is an example of a report published by KPMG. And this report was funded by Philip Morris, and that shows much higher estimates of illicit tobacco than all other sources. There is a systematic review of industry-funded studies on illicit tobacco, and that review found that all of these data that they produce are not reliable and that there is a fundamental lack of transparency throughout every stage of their research process. And that's why independently funded studies are crucial, such as the ones that we will be doing in the next few years. I also want to quickly mention how our situation compares with the situation in Aotearoa. Predictably, tobacco industry representatives have opposed the implementation of the Smoke-Free 2025 plan, claiming that this will fuel the illicit trade in tobacco. But the estimated illicit tobacco prevalence in New Zealand is about half of that of Australia, estimated at about 5.4% in Nick Wilson's littered pack study. And then furthermore, as highlighted in the study co-authored by Professors Richard Edwards and Janet Hook, among others, the low level of tobacco smuggling in New Zealand has remained low even after steep tobacco tax increases and the introduction of plain packaging. And as we know, these are both measures that the tobacco industry also claimed would increase illicit tobacco. As the authors of this article note, denicotization may temporarily increase illicit tobacco use among some people who don't want to quit, but people who smoke are far more likely to switch to vaping, as vaping products are and will be far more available in New Zealand than in Australia, and vaping is still likely to be a cheaper way of obtaining nicotine compared to illicit tobacco products. And these authors note that the plan should hopefully result in a greatly reduced demand for tobacco products overall, therefore shrinking both the legal and the illegal markets. So in summary, should we be concerned? My answer tentatively at this point is probably. Unlike New Zealand, it seems like Australia already has a fairly flourishing illicit tobacco market in the absence of any kind of tobacco endgame measures, and the ongoing struggle to prevent illicit vaping products and illicit drugs from entering the Australian market leaves me with some concern about how well we'll be able to prevent illicit tobacco from entering the market too. So this is why it is particularly timely and lucky that Coral and I have received fellowships to focus on this area in the next few years. So for example, one of the main objectives of Coral's future fellowship will be to improve estimates of the size of illicit tobacco markets, that we know that the data are more trustworthy, and test out different options to develop a triangulated system of monitoring the illicit tobacco market. And some of the methods for that will include surveys of retailers, wastewater analyses, key informer interviews, media analyses, and much, much more. My DECRA will be focusing on the drivers and deterrents. So that means investigating the characteristics of people who are at risk of purchasing illicit tobacco, and also investigating what are the effective deterrents to purchasing illicit tobacco? How can we deter consumers from choosing these products? And then Isabel, who's recently commissioned her PhD, one of her studies will be looking at the organized crime activity in the illicit tobacco market using state and national level data on illicit tobacco related seizures and arrests. All right, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. That was excellent. So we've got some questions online, but also if we have any questions from the audience, maybe put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you that you can go soon. So one of the comments online is, would the ATO data be more helpful if it referred to the number of sticks rather than the value, since excise increases lead to a value increase?
I think that would be useful information to have.
But I guess also the ATO are primarily concerned with the value, right? Because they're interested in the tax that's not being collected. So I would say yes, and maybe that's something that could be done, like a conversion or something like that.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea.
Another comment here about the ISIS link, or organised crime and so on. It's frequently promoted by big tobacco as an argument. So how do we manage that? Like looking at it and not wanting to, I guess, promote the same messages that the tobacco industry are using.
Yeah, I know. So that is the main reason I was so nervous for this presentation. Usually I'm never nervous at all, but I am terrified to stand up here and repeat the things that the tobacco industry says. But I tried my best to provide as many data sources as possible to not continue reinforcing their rhetoric. As to the links to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, it is something that is often commonly mentioned in the literature, and I've followed the sources, and it is hard to find the original arguments, the original evidence for that. So that is something that Isabel will be looking at more closely and will be looking at more closely. It is something I'm hesitant to say, but from what I've read, I think we can tentatively say that it probably is. The organized crime groups that are involved in this, it is fairly high-level groups.
And in the room.
Thanks, Cheneal. Really interesting. When you talk about organised crime, there are lots of different kinds of organised crime. Anybody who can bring large amounts in and get it distributed is organised crime. But some organised crime is linked to the illicit drug market, others may be linked to other groups. You've talked about Al-Qaeda, but I think it's really important to identify the relationships between this form of organised crime and other forms of identified crime, particularly the other drug market, because if you're getting your cigarettes from the same place you get your cocaine, then there are real risks of people transferring on to the other kinds of products.
No, I
More
completely agree.
Comment, I guess.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. That the study that I mentioned that Isabel will be doing will hopefully be teasing that out a bit more.
But, so do you have any idea how much of it is the drug syndicates that are doing it as compared with other groups?
Not at the moment. We had one initial chat with Australian Border Force, and they suggested that their focus is those large groups because that's where the majority of it is coming from. But at this point, we don't know.
And, there's also, I guess, some disorganised crime happening with just, what would you say, people just importing small amounts to sell on the side through online shopping sites and things like that, and through personal networks and so on.
Yes, something that I actually wanted to mention and forgot was, so Heewon's been chatting to us quite a lot about this, and her and Ara noticed there's an online marketplace for South Korean people living in Brisbane, and there are a lot of listings on their marketplace website for products from South Korea and other countries. How much were they? They were very cheap, less than half the price of what you would buy here. So it seems that those sort of community groups of people from other countries might be one of the most common sources. And the fact that there are so many South Korean boxes on the streets of Brisbane suggests that might be the case. We also discovered you can buy illicit tobacco on Etsy. And for those who don't know, Etsy is an arts and crafts generally website. So I typed in tobacco and couldn't believe how many results I found. There's also mushrooms. Yeah.
So, that wasn't an online selling site that I was expecting to see tobacco on, but there you go. I've got another question here. Has there been any modelling of the potential size of the illicit market related to Endgame policies?
Chris is shaking his head.
I'm looking at Driss and he's like shaking his head. So
it's coming.
It's coming.
Excellent.
It's coming. Okay. Are there any other questions for Cheneal? Or comments or... Okay, well, we might keep moving then. Oh, I've got another one here. If it is some of the culturally and linguistically diverse communities who are using illicit tobacco, then a call to action should be to fund multicultural tobacco prevention programs. Yes.
Absolutely agree.
And maybe some of these online networks would be a good place to tap into those people and offer some support for quitting. Great. Okay.